So quickly, a little bit about me. So I've been at Seven Signal now for, I guess 2.5 years at this point. Um, Before Seven Signal, I have a little over a decade experience supporting, designing, maintaining enterprise networks between like the actual Wi-Fi networks on the enterprise, more so the routing, switching of those networks, whether it be SD-WANs, whether it be the firewalls that are segmenting the networks, all of that. I've kind of touched it all from a network perspective. As Heather mentioned previously, I do live in the Pacific Northwest, and I actually have he's a little over a 1 year old. He's sitting right next to me asleep right now, but he is a Lagotto Romagnolo, kind of looks like a doodle. So yeah, so been having fun with a puppy for the past year or so. So kind of a quick overview of some of the topic and kind of what we're going to be covering today. Um, just kind of an intro into what EAP authentication is, kind of dig into some of the different methods of EAP authentication, whether it's EAP-TLS, EAP-TTLS, EAP-PEEP, as well as EAP-FAST, and kind of talking about the advantages of the authentication, and kind of how you would implement EAP in an enterprise network, some kind of best practices to use when specifically deploying EAP authentication for your Wi-Fi network, kind of the pros and cons of it, how it impacts the user experience as well. We're all about making sure the user has a good experience when using the network. That's kind of the key here. And then as well as we'll dig into a little bit of how you can troubleshoot some authentication issues. So kind of a high level overview of kind of the flow of EAP. Um, Essentially what happens is it's essentially four different stages here, or four different flows. You have the request that's coming from the authenticator to the supplicant and requesting its identity, whether that's a password, a certificate, a token. You can vary. The supplicant will then respond to the authenticator with its information. So it will send its token, send its certificate, and then that authenticator will then forward it to the actual server that's doing the authentication. And then you'll either get a success or you'll get a failure to indicate whether or not the authentication succeeded or not. And then kind of what is EAP authentication? So EAP is strictly just a framework for authentication. It's a standardized kind of authentication method that's used in the industry. And then there are inner methods to the overall EAP that's being used. So like I said, TLS, TTLS, EAP-FAST, EAP-PEEP. We'll get into those in the next slides here. Um, it it is securing um, the connection between the client and the infrastructure itself. So it allows um, the client and the server to exchange credentials and verify each other. That's the key, is that you're not only verifying the client, but the client is verifying the server itself. So quickly here, kind of the overview of some different methods. So for EAP-TLS, if you've ever dealt with certificates, that this is kind of the primary authentication method that you will be using. So it's using a certificate on the client as well as the authentication server. And during this authentication process, both of them are um, providing certificates to each other. The client will provide its certificate to the server. The server will then verify that it is a trusted signed cert. And then the client will also verify the server certificate is using a trusted certificate authority as well. So you have a high level of security, um, with this method, it's encrypting the entire authentication process as well. So you're protecting usernames, passwords, everything else that can be associated with the actual authentication. And it's considered one of the most secure EAP methods specifically. And then EAP-TTLS is kind of similar, but it only requires the server side to have the certificate. So you'll verify that the authentication server has a valid cert as the client. It's a little more flexible in deployments because you don't have to manage certificates on all the client endpoint devices. And it also gives you some flexibility in that you don't have to authenticate with a certificate. You could use a password, you could use a token, but if you do still want to use a certificate, you can do that as well. So the benefit for this is how compatible it is with quite a few different client devices and OSs as well. One of the more popular EAP methods, I think it may kind of be coming out of popularity, especially with Windows 11. I forgot what the feature is called, but by default, it's basically losing support for like MS Chat v2 type authentication. So EAP-PEEP still uses a server-side certificate to authenticate. And then the client is using an inner authentication method within the tunnel that's being established. So that could be TLS, that could be MS CHAP. There's a lot of different inner methods that can be used with PEEP. And again, that's how you're essentially establishing a TLS tunnel, and then within that tunnel, you're doing the authentication portion. So again, it could be passwords, it could be tokens, it could be certificates. It kind of the inner authentication method of EAP is the tricky point, and where we're moving away from kind of the older archaic or the older insecure or less secure methods and moving into other options. And then you have EAP-FAST. This was entirely developed by Cisco. It's kind of not as popular as the other methods. It's still used. It's very similar to the other ones in some regards, but it does a few things a little different. So it does a TLS tunnel similar to EAP and the others, but it also uses a protected access credential or a PAC to establish the authentication. And then those are essentially what the client is using to authenticate with. So they're pre-established between the client and the authentication server, and then they're either installed manually, or you can kind of provision them to have the PAC on the client device automatically. And the big thing here is it completely removes certificates out of the entire equation here. So kind of some advantages of why you would want to use EAP authentication as opposed to a different other type of authentication, like a pre-shared key based authentication. So EAP is using kind of a robust framework that only authorized users can then access the network. So you're using a strong authentication to verify the users that need access to the network. And like I said, it can be client or sorry, certificate-based authentication. It can be username and password, tokens. It gives you flexibility as an organization to choose whatever kind of best suits your security requirements. It also provides a kind of it establishes a secure encrypted means or a channel between the client and the authentication server. So sensitive user credentials will be encrypted during the entire authentication process. It also supports mutual authentication. This is the big key. And like I mentioned previously, we're not only verifying the client device, the client is verifying the authentication server. So it allows you to essentially trust specific servers as a client, which can help with, say, man-in-the-middle attacks, where if a certificate is not quite the same, it will prompt that user, or it will just deny the authentication altogether, that this is not a valid authentication server, so we're not going to authenticate against it. We're not going to provide our certificate to this server. It allows for centralized authentication and management. So your user credentials are centrally managed. This very simplifies um, the admin work or the enforcement of company security policies. Instead of having to manage multiple authentication kind of endpoints or authentication servers, you can centralize this into one location to kind of help you in terms of that flexibility and of deploying in a large area, that kind of thing. It also is very scalable. It's suitable for a very small Wi-Fi network. It's suitable for a large enterprise network. And then the biggest thing too is it allows you to be compliant with different types of security standards. So if you're familiar with like PCI, for example, it very much helps with those kind of industry requirements or other government regulations, to where you have to have a specific security standard that you're meeting. And in terms of actually implementing EAP authentication, some kind of best practices to use preparing for it. You want to just start by assessing what are your actual security requirements for your network. You need to think about the sensitivity of what data you're transmitting over the network. Are there any requirements for you to be compliant to a specific standard, as well as what level of user input or user authentication do you want to be required? Do you want a user to manually type in a username and password? Do you want it to be seamless to the user, where they have a certificate that's on their machine that is then authenticating for them, and their level of involvement is minimum at that point? And then once you've established your requirements, you can then just determine what EAP method is best suited for your deployment, and which one aligns with your requirements. So you can evaluate the strengths, the weaknesses, the compatibilities of each of those methods, um, based off of, say, security levels, if you want to manage certificates, as well as the actual infrastructure that you would need to support it. And then once you've established which method you would want, that's when you would actually plan out and prepare your infrastructure to support the EAP method that you've chosen. So you need to make sure that your network, say, has a radius server, which would be your authentication server at that point. If you're using certificates, do you want to have your own CA server, or would you prefer to have a trusted signed certificate that's managed everything? So like there's all sorts of them out there, like DigiTrust, for example. So all of these components come together to then support your EAP authentication and integrate within your existing network infrastructure. Excuse me. The other thing you may want to think about is certificate management. So if you're using certificate-based authentication, like I said, your CAs, your third-party CAs, you want to issue, you want to manage those certificates. Certificates need to be enrolled, they need to be renewed. If something happens and a device gets lost, you want to be able to revoke a certificate. So the certificate management piece can be um, kind of the sticky point in terms of establishing, say, EAP-TLS is dealing with the certificates. Once you have that, you want to actually configure the authentication servers. So you want to configure that radius server, make it support your EAP method that you've chosen. set up your policies for the user authentication, the authorization, as well as the accounting. So you want to not only authenticate them, provide them with the level of access that they need, as well as logging it to keep records. Um, and then your client side configuration. That this is again dependent on your EAP method. If you're using certificates, if you're using username and passwords, that's all dependent on what you've chosen. If you're using certificates, you need to make sure that you have client certificates enrolled, and so you can have your devices properly configured. Once you have everything configured, that's when you can test it and actually roll it out and deploy it. So you want to test it in kind of a controlled environment, to ensure that everything's functional, everything's compatible. You want to verify user authentication. You want to verify certificate validation. You want to verify the connectivity once everything's been authenticated. And then once that is done, that's when you can actually roll it out to your network. I would recommend doing like a phased approach. So instead of rolling it out to however many devices you have, let's say you have 10,000 devices, you can kind of stagger the rollout to avoid headaches down the road. And then always the fun part is maintaining and monitoring it. So you want to monitor how well the authentication is performing, maintain it. If something happens, you want to be able to fix it, whether you have the redundancy in place or failovers for your authentication servers. Those are things you kind of have to think about, as well as patching and keeping it up to date with firmware updates, renewing certificates, those kind of things. And then the other fun part is making sure your users are aware. So if you're moving from, say, like a pre-shared key or even completely open authentication on your Wi-Fi network, your users are going to be kind of confused why things have changed. So providing them with education and support upfront is kind of valuable. I have the policy that over communication is better than no communication. So you want to communicate everything to them, kind of the benefits of why you're moving this way, um, as well as kind of what is changing to their workflows. And then you can offer assistance resources if any of their devices need to be specifically configured or if they have an issue. It just helps to establish that line of communication. So some best practices for that deployment, plan. You want to make sure that everything's designed well. If it's not designed well, it will never work. That's kind of the first and most important part of any type of network deployment or anything network related, in my opinion, is making sure that it's properly planned and designed. Once you have that, it's verifying you've chosen the correct EAP method. So, like I said, you want to take into account all the requirements that you have in your specific infrastructure, and then select TLS, TTLS, PEAP, FAST, those methods that um, that fit your needs. I would recommend implementing certificate-based authentication if it's possible. It's like I said, it's less involvement from a client perspective in terms of the actual authentication process. It's also more secure. So it may be a little bit more in terms of a management, but it's not much, and it allows the experience for the user to kind of be better. You want to have a centralized authentication server, like we talked about, that allows you just managing it is easier. Dealing with logs and verifying things is easier when everything's centrally managed. Um, so you can just establish that user management, the authentication, the authorization in one central location. You also want to have strong security policies. So you want to enforce password complexity. You want to have account lockout policies in place, session timeouts as well. You can also think about doing multi-factor or MFA whenever possible, just to increase the level of security. You want to enable logging, monitoring, kind of having a detailed log and an audit trail is very valuable whenever you're um, looking for potential security incidents, whether it's authentication failures and you want to troubleshoot it, or if unauthorized access attempts have been made, having the logs of your authentication server to go back to is very valuable. Another thing in terms of securing your network is segmented. So you can consider just network segmentation to separate out the sensitive areas of your network from the less sensitive areas of your network. To do this, it's pretty simple. You can just use different VLANs and then segment out that way, or you can get a little more complex and actually build out DMZs with firewalls and kind of have fun with that as well. But at a base level, just a simple VLAN to segregate the network is all you need to do. And then, like I said, you want to perform testing, validation, and it's ongoing as well. You still want to test things after you've deployed so you can verify and continuously improve how the authentication is performing or make updates as well. Um, and again, user education, providing your user support and keeping things up to date, not just your Wi-Fi network, but as well as your authentication servers, your client devices. Everything needs to be maintained and updated regularly. And then on to the user experience. So what is a user going to notice when moving into a EAP authentication specific way of connecting to the network? Your authentication time will increase. So if you're going from a pre-shared key or you're going from just an open network, um, the authentication time that the user's taking now has to also include the request from the supplicant, the client providing its credentials to the supplicant that then forwards it to the application server that then comes back to the other device. So all of this is kind of increasing the time it takes to initially connect to the network. Another thing is user credential input. So if you're using username and password, that's something that a user may need to manually type in. So it's something that they have to now type in each time that they're connecting. Or you can simplify it to where it's passing through the username and password that you're using to log on to the computer, or you're using a certificate as well. So you can manage that as well. But in doing so, now you have certificate management. So if you have digital certificates that are being used, it requires the end device to not only have their client side certificate, but they need to also trust the server side certificate. So this can just add complexity and depending on how your deployment is used, um, can require different user involvement and awareness. The other thing too is compatibility configuration. Some client devices may not even support the EAP specific authentication method. I know a lot of IoT devices that I have seen do not. They have kind of very cheap hardware that only supports pre-shared key authentication. So you kind of are limited in depending on what client devices you have. And again, everything in my opinion comes back to the user education, making sure they're familiar. But another benefit is that with EAP authentication, uh, users can kind of seamlessly roam between APs, and the entire process is encrypted. So the re-authentication to the new AP is encrypted, and it just seamlessly roams from an AP to an AP, providing you have the configuration correct on the back end. The other benefit here is the added security, the added trust. that comes with EAP authentication as well. So some quick kind of troubleshooting steps that you can take too if you have an EAP or an authentication specific issue. You want to first gather as much information or relative or relevant information that you have, so you can understand exactly what the client or what the end user is complaining about. That they're how they're impacted. Then you want to verify network connectivity. So you want to verify that excuse me, you want to verify that the client device that's actually experiencing the authentication issue has a proper network connectivity. Check to verify that it can connect to other networks or other resources. You can verify signal strength. You can verify the actual wireless infrastructure as well. Are you sending beacons every interval that every 100 microseconds, that kind of thing? You want to verify that your infrastructure is working before you verify your authentication portion. Are you even able to associate to the radio, that kind of thing? And then once you've established that, verify that the EAP method you're using is configured correctly, that your settings are all configured correctly, verified on both the client device and the server. So verify your certificates, make sure your certificates are up to date. So verify your credentials essentially. Check your logs. You can then analyze the traffic. So there's a few different ways you can go about specifically troubleshooting these kind of issues. And then some tools you can use specifically to help with kind of the full-on troubleshooting process. The best is just a raw packet capture. So you can kind of see with Wireshark, with TCP dump, you can analyze and kind of go through the full flow of the packets that you're looking at, and then kind of help to look for any anomalies or any errors, that kind of thing. You can use network analyzers, so you can do like SolarWinds has their NPM monitoring. Other companies have network monitors as well. You can look at NetFlow, for example. You can configure a NetFlow server and kind of look at the flow of the data. So you can then monitor the devices, monitor the traffic patterns, that kind of thing. Look at the logs on the authentication server, so you can kind of see how at least on the back end, how the Radius server is handling a specific authentication. There are certificate management tools you can use. So I think Microsoft has their Microsoft Certificate Services, I believe is what it's called, where you can kind of view a certificate detail. There's also OpenSSL that you can use to look at certificate details and kind of verify, hey, do I have the full chain? Do I have the root CA of a signed cert? Is the cert valid? Is it up to, or is it expired? Those kind of things. You can also use vendor, just look at documentation of that the vendors are providing. So you can consult that documentation if you're looking for specific types of troubleshooting guides for a specific authentication server you have or a specific infrastructure you have, those kind of things. You can review your network configs. So if you're making any changes, for example, going through a change control process and keeping track of what changes you have made in the past. So if you know authentication broke on X day, you can then go back in your change review logs or change review board and view what changes were made on that day that could then impact your authentication now. Making sure things are up to date, software updates, firmware updates, all that fun stuff. And then as well as our product. So a good resource to look at troubleshooting authentication. And I'm sure Eric will be kind of going over this as well, kind of in more detail, is the Sapphire Eye. So I wanted to show you kind of the process, and I took some graphs here of what we can show you with Sapphire, but kind of the process that it's taken anyway. So the first step is just the associating to the radio. So this is we can measure the time it takes to associate and actually connect to the radio. This is before EAP even comes into play. So if you're having issues even attaching to the radio of the AP before EAP, it's going to show different types of issues there. And then the full radius authentication flow. So phase one, this is the time it will take between the association that we just saw and then the start of the EAP authentication, or when the authenticator sent to the client its request to verify who they were, essentially. And then phase two is whenever the between the previous authentication and then the time in which the authentication server has proposed which EAP method it's going to be using to validate the user. And then this is the phase in which the client and the authentication server now have established which method to use, and they've agreed to it. And then here it is, the phase in which the client is verifying the authentication server's certificate. So this is the time it takes from the client to then receive the cert, validate it, and say, okay, this is a valid cert. And then the last phase is actually establishing that connection between the client and the authentication server specifically. So the nice thing about EAP authentication and just authentication in general as well with Wi-Fi is you get status codes. So if you have a status code of 0 in your radio authentication process, 0 just means that it was successful. So you can kind of look up tables that give you a full list of different status and deauth codes as well. So this can help you with kind of troubleshooting not only EAP authentication issues, but it can just help you troubleshoot wireless connection issues as well. So there's a full list of association codes. There's also a full list of deauthentication codes. So 3 is one of the ones that you will see the most common. This is just saying that the station or the client device is now leaving the area of this AP. So it's leaving the ESS of this AP. And here's a full list as well. Another thing with the Sapphire Eye, you can look at EAP specific KPIs that we have. So you can measure, okay, are we having any issues to where we have to do retries where the first authentication attempt fails? Maybe we have to try again. This you can verify and track how many times you actually are needed for your authentication attempts within a given time. So you can see here that this particular example, there's a large number of connections that it doesn't succeed on the first try. We have to retry, and then that second time is when we actually authenticate. So there's also an EAP method type registry. So you can see with the data here that we can gather which EAP method you're actually using, and you can verify it. So if you look here at this chart, and here's a full list of all the different types here. Number 13 is EAP-TLS. And again, there's a registry, and each EAP method has a value. So if you're looking at within the packet itself, you'll see a value that's then associated to an EAP authentication method. So, and at that, we can go to some Q&A.
Very good. Let me emerge from my hiding here. All right, we've definitely got several questions. I was actually just going through them. I think we kind of answered some of them along the way. So Let's start with an anonymous attendee who submits a question. First of all, thank you for having the webinar on this topic. And question is, can you mention some of the different important auth attacks and measures to avoid them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot really. So the biggest thing here in terms of avoiding an authentication attack is making sure that you've built out that back end portion so you can have logging, you can have kind of monitoring trends, that kind of thing. But in terms of different attacks, you can have man in the middle to where you're presenting yourself as an attacker. You would present yourself as the infrastructure that the client would then connect to, and then you're sending them your own certificate or your own back-end authentication, and they're providing you with their credentials. So the key thing there is making sure that your authentication server certificate that you're using, specifically in EAP authentication, is valid and trusted by the client, because if it doesn't match, say, what the attacker's using, it will not connect to it. So that's one way you can avoid it. There's other types of attacks, though. You could have someone try and just brute force their way in with trying username and passwords, and that's where having the like account lockout settings and those kind of things um, are very valuable. To where if they have, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 unsuccessful attempts in a row, you can kind of block that communication, that kind of thing. Hope that answers that question.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Larry, bringing it back to Radius, could you please mention the pros and cons of using a Radius server versus TACACS for authentication?
What is that acronym? I'm not familiar with TACA. Where is that? Oh,
Um,
TACACS. Is that what that is?
yeah.
Yeah, so TACACS authentication is more for device administration. So think more like you logging into a switch, you logging into a router, that kind of thing. The Radius portion is more establishing the client or an endpoint to have access to the network. So it's similar, but it's different approaches here. So the TACACS is, think of it more as your username, password, or however you're authenticating is providing you access to managing the infrastructure, where the Radius is allowing you to use the infrastructure, if that makes sense.
All right, let's see. Okay, let's see. We got some more from anonymous attendees. I don't know, Jack, do you have the Q&A panel up? And I don't know if there's one you prefer. We probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. For EAP authentication and WPA 2 or 3, can you please clarify the difference? That's one of them from anonymous.
Not quickly. So WPA2 and WPA3 are they're similar but very different. I think we've had an entire webinar just over WPA3. So if you're interested in the differences between WPA2 and WPA3, I don't have enough time in a Q&A to give you an answer. I would recommend looking back at some of our other webinars that we've done. You can find one on YouTube. I think Thomas is one that's done a WPA3 topic previously. So that's what I would recommend to kind of figure out the differences between WPA2 and WPA3, is just going back to a previous hour-long discussion that we've had specifically on WPA3. But yes, that statement that Phil just put in the chat is probably the best succinct way of putting what the difference is.
I think
That WPA3 is very similar to WPA2, but it's using protected management frames. But again, if you want to know more, it's hard to answer that question in just 1 or 2 minutes. Correct. Yeah, the enterprise version.
All right, we have time for one more. Any of these in here look good, Jack? For our last one.
We can, yeah, that second one that Forrest put in. So the settings that you are configuring for specifically EAP authentication, there's different places you'll do different configs. So you'll have, it doesn't have to be only on a controller-based deployment. So I have an AP that's standalone. It gives me the option to have a cloud managed, so it would be similar to controller-based deployment. But I'm not using that. I just have um, I have free radius running as well in my lab that I'm using. So I've just established that this specific AP is my authenticator, and then the config is then pointing to my radius server, and then it's working that way. So it's not only for controller-based deployments. Controller-based deployments just make the config easier.